Thank you so much for being here, for hanging out with us. It's so good to see you. Thank you for those of you who are on our campus here with us. Thank you for those of you watching online. We are continuing in our series through the book of Romans. We've been in this series for quite a while, and actually we have 2 weeks left. This week and next week we'll wrap it up. And so Romans is a letter that the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Rome. Paul is the guy who's responsible for traveling all over the Roman Empire and starting a bunch of new churches in the first century world. And when he writes this letter to Rome, he's never actually been to Rome. He's hoping to go to Rome, and so he writes this letter to kind of introduce himself, and he's hoping to use Rome as a base of operation. And so Romans, in a lot of ways, is considered Paul's masterpiece letter. Because what he does in Romans, he does it in a certain regard in other letters, but nowhere as thorough as in Romans, is he really lays out, this is what Christian faith is all about. This is what it really means to be a Christian. And so we've kind of been working our way through the book of Romans, and we're coming almost to the end. And when you get to the end now, there's one last thing that Paul wants to talk about, and he's hinted at it throughout the letter of Romans, and if you've been here, we've kind of made comments about it. And so he's addressed it a little bit, but before he closes his letter out, he wants to really thoroughly address this because it's a major issue. And the issue that Paul's going to address that's happening in the church in Rome is it's an issue of division. And the issue of division that the church in Rome is facing is not unique to Rome. In fact, a lot of the letters Paul writes to churches that we have in the New Testament, they're facing division, and they're facing the same kind of division. But the situation is a little bit unique in Rome because it's reversed from what most of the other churches are dealing with. So if you go back to the life of Jesus kind of starts this movement. He recruits these followers, mainly this group of 12 that's known as the apostles. And the thing about Jesus and the apostles that we have to remember is they're all Jewish. Jesus is a devout Jewish guy, lives a devout Jewish life. All his closest followers are Jewish. Throughout Jesus' lifetime, he does things to break barriers, to engage with people who are not Jewish. And Gentiles is anyone who's not Jewish. So Jesus does things to begin to cross barriers and engage Gentiles. He kind of makes it clear that what he's doing isn't going to be just a Jewish thing. It's going to be for Gentiles too. But the church, what we call the church, when we talk about the church, Jesus doesn't actually begin the church during his lifetime. Jesus lays the groundwork for the church. He kind of lays the foundation. And then Jesus dies and he raises again. And kind of the last thing Jesus does is what we often call his ascension. Jesus gathers his followers together one more time, gives them his kind of farewell message, and then he ascends up into heaven, promising to return one day. And what Jesus does at the ascension is he sends his followers out. He says, hey, now I'm sending you out on this mission. That the church is to be a continuation of the mission that began in Jesus. That in Jesus, God is making the world right. Jesus' death and resurrection is the means by which God is making everything right. He's saving creation. He's making all of creation new. And the people of God, the people, Jesus' followers at this point, they are now supposed to go out and announce that and also live that. So they're supposed to go into all the world, not just to Jews, but to Gentiles and everybody, and to proclaim that, hey, in Jesus, God is making everything right. And this is not just this thing we proclaim, it's how we live. We now live with God as our King. And so that is the context out of which the church is born, because it's after Jesus' ascension. Then if you read the book of Acts, which is the book that talks about the origin and expansion of the early church, the followers of Jesus are all together in Jerusalem, and the Holy Spirit comes on them, and they begin to talk, and thousands of people begin to follow Jesus, and the church is born. So the church doesn't exist in Jesus' lifetime. Jesus lays the foundation for it, but it actually begins after his ascension, and it begins with this mission. The church, in that sense, is missional. It's not social. The church only exists because there is a mission which God wants to accomplish. There's a lot of other organizations or groups that are like social groups. You may get together with a group of people because, hey, you have this in common, we have this hobby in common, or whatever. But the church, the only reason the church exists is because God is on a mission to reclaim, restore, and save his creation. And the church is supposed to go into all the world and announce that and live that. And so what happens when the church is born is you have this movement that begins within Judaism, but then it begins to spread out and more Gentiles begin to join the church. And this creates tension between Jews and Gentiles. Because for centuries now at this point, Jews have lived their life according to the law that they got from Moses, way back in the first part of the Bible called the Old Testament. And Jews had these certain things that they considered identity markers. And by identity markers, I mean they were things that this is what defines the people of God. If you do these things, you are the people of God. If you don't do them, you're not the people of God. And like some of the big ones have to do with food. What kind of food do you eat? Jews lived by very kosher diets, and they were very structured diets. Another one was holidays. Did you celebrate all the Jewish holidays? There's a few others that pop up during Jesus' life, but those are a couple of the big ones. And so even when the church begins and Gentiles begin to join the church, Gentiles don't eat the same diet that Jews do. They don't celebrate all these holidays. And for Jewish people, this is an issue. Like, no, we have to do this. These are our identity markers. This is what makes us the people of God. And yes, even though Jesus showed up and he changed everything and it's all like, we still need to do these things. So you have Jews that are advocating, hey, we need to do these kind of cultural things. And you have Gentiles that are saying, no, we don't. And so that creates tension. And so the early church has to wrestle with, what does it really mean to be a Christian? And actually, if you read in Acts 15, there's a big meeting of the church leadership in Jerusalem, which is primarily Jewish, and you have people from both sides make their arguments, and the church comes to the conclusion, the church leadership officially makes the decision, no, you do not have to be Jewish to be a part of the church. You don't have to follow all of these Jewish laws and customs and tradition. And so the decision has been made, but just because a decision has been made doesn't mean there's still not disagreement and tension. But what's unique about the situation in Rome is, for the most part, the churches in all these cities, they begin in Jewish communities and then Gentiles join them. So the Jews have all the power and authority. They're the ones that are in control. And so when Paul writes to a lot of these churches, he's writing to a Jewish leadership saying, hey, you need to let these Gentiles in. But Rome, the reason why Rome's unique is Paul writes Romans toward the end of the 50s, like the mid to late 50s. In the year 50, Emperor Claudius, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire, he kicked all the Jews out of Rome, forced them to leave, and then sometime after 53, he allows them to come back. And so when Paul writes Romans, he's writing to a group that they were Jews and Gentiles. All the Jews got kicked out, so that all that's left is Gentiles. So the church suddenly becomes all Gentile, including the leadership. Then the Jews are allowed to come back, but they come back to a church that is run by Gentiles. And so in Rome, you have the same Jew-Gentile tension, but the difference is, in Rome, the Gentiles are in charge, and the Jews are kind of like the marginalized ones. And so they have all this tension. So Paul is writing this to help them figure out, how do we kind of work through this tension? How do we kind of work through this Jew and Gentile tension, which is actually the biggest issue that plagues the early church, is this kind of ethnic, racial tension of Jews and Gentiles. What does it mean? What do we have to do? And the way Paul's going to talk about it is he's going to use two terms. And here's the terms he's going to use. He's going to use weak and strong. He's going to refer to a group as weak in faith, and he's going to refer to a group as strong in faith. Now, I want us to understand before we read this, Paul's not using this as a critique of one group's faith versus another. Paul's not looking at them saying, you guys are absolutely right, you're the strong ones, good for you, you're all about God, and you guys are pathetic and weak. That's not what he's saying. Because here's the reality. If there's a disagreement, if like within the context of the church, if we have a disagreement with people, which we do all the time, we always assume that we're right, and we always assume that we're the strong one, don't we? It's like, well, I'm right. Why? Because clearly I'm right and you're wrong. And so in one sense, it doesn't really matter, because like each side is going to see themselves as strong and the other as weak. But Paul's going to use these as a way to kind of talk about, how do we navigate? Now for Paul, just so we're aware, Paul is going to refer to the Jews as the weak ones. Again, not because he's criticizing them, but because what Paul's saying is, listen, your faith requires of you to do all these things that you don't really have to do. Michael Bird, he's a New Testament scholar, when he defines weak, he says it's this: a person who Paul is talking about in this context who is weak is someone whose conscience is easily pricked or is easily offended. So it's just someone who, man, your faith requires a bunch of this stuff that really isn't necessary. And you probably deep down know it's not necessary, but you've always done it and you need to do it, and you feel like if you don't, then something's wrong, or you would criticize someone who doesn't do these things. And then strong, on the other hand, is Paul's going to refer to the Gentiles. And this is people who realize, like, I don't have to do all these things. They're not necessarily bad, they're not necessarily evil, but I don't have to do them to earn God's approval or to be a good person of faith. And so I just want us to be clear that Paul's not being derogatory toward any group. He's not saying one group's better than the other. He's just using these to kind of talk about these perspectives. And really at stake here is still wrestling through this question of, what does it mean to be a Christian. They've already decided it in Acts 15 at the Council of Jerusalem. Like the main church leadership has made a decision, but now all the local churches, all the local congregations have to figure out, yeah, but what does it really mean for us to be a Christian here in Rome when we have this issue between weak and strong and we don't agree? Now, here at FCC, the way that we define Christian, for what it's worth, this is a definition we came up with. You won't see this anywhere else, but it's ours, is a Christian is someone who lives their life in response to what God has done and is doing through Jesus. This is what makes someone a Christian. We're a part of this movement called the Stone Campbell movement. That's where our tradition came out of. We're a non-denominational church and that we don't belong to any organization. We are entirely self-governing. But we came from this movement that started in the mid-1800s that was a unity movement. You had Barton Stone and then the Campbells, who was a father and a son, and they basically got tired of all the division within churches. And so they created this movement that was designed to be a unity movement. They dropped all their denominational names, and they just used the title Christian because one of their slogans, they had a bunch of slogans, but one of them was, we're not the only Christians, we're just Christians only. Like that's what we want our identity to be. What are we? We are followers of Christ. We don't define ourselves by this thing or that thing. And one of the other interesting things they did is if you've been around Christianity or Christian faith at all, there's these things called creeds. The big ones are like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creeds. They're these big statements of faith that came like a long time ago, that these councils like in the 300s, when the Roman Empire first converted to Christianity, they came up with these creeds. And they're all statements of like, this is what like Orthodox Christians believe. We believe this, we believe this, we believe that. When the Stone Campbell movement came along, they kind of like rejected all those creeds. Now, this is important. They didn't reject the creeds because they were false. They're absolutely true, what they say. But here's what Stone and Campbell argued, and I think they're right, and it's really interesting, that before the creeds, before you had all the creeds of like, I believe this, I believe this, I believe that, what made someone a Christian isn't what they believed, it's what they did. So for example, when you talked about forgiveness, forgiveness isn't something the early church believed, it's what they did. Restoration wasn't something the early church believed, it's something that they did. Well, now all of a sudden when the creeds come along, the creed's like, well, I believe this, I believe this. You can believe a whole lot of things and you don't actually have to do any of them. And so what creeds do is, and I don't think it was intentional, I think the creeds were designed to like, hey, let's define, Christian faith and what it is. But the creeds made Christianity something that you believe, a checklist of things that you believe, instead of all these things that you do. And so Paul exists in a time before these kind of creeds. And so Paul's trying to help the church work out like, this is what it really means to be a Christian. It's not just about what you believe. Yeah, what you believe is important, but it's about who you are and what you do. And this was the heart of the movement that we came from, is trying to understand that like, hey, it's not just about Christianity. It's not about a belief system. It's about how we live. And what we're going to see in Paul, which I think is true, and we all know this, is that life is messy. It just is. And we want things to be clean, and we want things to be simple, and we want things to be, here it is. But it's not always like that. It's not always that easy. It's gray. A lot of life is gray, and a lot of life is messy. And so how do you navigate that mess when you find yourself in the context of a community of people and you disagree with other people? How do you navigate that? And this is what Paul's going to unpack. And I think what Paul has to say here is incredibly helpful for us and the context in which we find ourselves. So here's how Paul starts it. Romans 14, verse 1. He says, accept those whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters. One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not. And the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them both. And so, again, Paul's dealing with this divide, this Jew and Gentile, weak and strong divide, and the example that he chooses to use has to do with eating food. Because, again, that's one of the big Jewish identity markers, is we live by this strict diet. And Paul talks about meat and vegetables. Understand, Paul's not advocating for, like, you should be a carnivore, you should be a vegetarian. That's not what he's getting at all. What Paul's getting at, and the reason why he uses this as an example and why it's a meaningful example for the people in Rome, is oftentimes in the Roman Empire, in this first century world, when people would slaughter an animal to eat, like you're going to cut it up and make steak or whatever out of it, is as they were doing it, they would offer it as a sacrifice to their god or goddess. So in the case of Rome, you're offering it to some pagan god or goddess. And so it becomes this sacrifice to this deity that if you're a Christian, you don't worship at all. Now, where that becomes an issue for Jews is if you ate the food that was sacrificed to this god, people would then see you as living under the provision of this god or goddess. And so if you were successful, part of the reason that you would be successful is because you were living under the provision of this god or goddess to whom your food was sacrificed to. And so you'd have a lot of devout Jewish people that would avoid this kind of food, not because they didn't like meat, not because they thought it was unhealthy or bad, but because they wanted to avoid any amount of anything that could look like idolatry. One of the famous places you see this, if you go in the Old Testament, the story of Daniel. Daniel he lives in Israel, he's a Jewish man. Babylon comes in and conquers them. They take a bunch of people back to Babylon. Daniel goes back to Babylon to work for the king. He gets offered the best food. Daniel rejects the food and only eats vegetables. And the reason, again, he does that isn't just because he wants to be a vegetarian, although there's nothing wrong with being a vegetarian. It's because he doesn't want to give the appearance of idolatry, that he's somehow given in to these Babylonian gods or goddesses. And so that's the issue Paul's dealing with. He's not dealing with which one is a better idol. He's dealing with, on the one hand, you have Gentiles who are eating this meat because they don't really care. But on the other hand, you have some Jews who will not eat it because they don't want to even give the appearance that they're associated with these pagan gods or goddesses. Paul also deals with this in 1 Corinthians, by the way, and he kind of goes a little bit more details into the specifics of it in 1 Corinthians. But what he really says, he goes, look, the gods and goddesses that they're sacrificing this to, they don't even exist. So it's totally pointless. So for Paul, the important thing to understand is, for Paul, this is not a right or wrong sin issue. Paul doesn't see this as well, this is clearly right and this is clearly wrong. Because if Paul saw it that way, he would say it. Paul's very clear in places about this is right, this is wrong. So there are things about the way we live and the way we treat each other that are right and wrong. What Paul's talking about here is not right or wrong things. Paul refers to it as disputable matters. That's what he says. These are disputable matters, which means you can be a Christian and fall on either side of this. And notice the first thing that Paul says. Don't fight over disputable matters. Well, we screwed that one up already, didn't we? So we already messed up Paul's first thing, because how many disputable matters do we have in our current cultural context that we have just fought over? So we already messed that up. But anyway, let's go on. So Paul says, first thing is, don't fight. These are disputable matters. You can be a God-loving, devout Christian on either side of this. Don't fight over this. But then he gives advice to both sides. He gives advice to the strong and he gives advice to the weak. And what he says is he goes, listen, if you're on the side that says, yes, I could eat this meat, I can do this thing. He says, then don't look with contempt on people that won't do it. Don't criticize them. Don't look down on them. Don't think you're better than them. Don't think that somehow you're stronger or you're the real Christian and they're not. Paul says, because that's not true. And on the other side, he says, now if you're looking at it saying, I won't do this, don't judge the people on the other side that do. Don't judge them and question, well, you're not really a Christian, because if you were, you wouldn't do this and you wouldn't do this and you wouldn't do that. So he gives advice on both sides. Don't look with contempt and don't judge. And he bridges that advice, he bookends that advice with the same word. He uses the word at the beginning, he uses the word at the end. The word is accept. Don't look with contempt, don't judge, but instead accept one another. He says, I want you to accept one another at the beginning because God has accepted you. Now, the New Testament's originally written in Greek. In Greek, that word accept literally means to bring someone to yourself. To literally pull them in, to bring them to yourself, and it carries with it the ideas of joy and protection. So here's Paul's advice. Paul says, you find yourself in a disagreement with someone. This is a disputable matter, in disagreement with someone. You know how you should respond to them? Pull them into yourself out of a sense of joy and protect them. Not fight with them, not yell at them, not passive-aggressively tell them how stupid they are, not go all over their Facebook and just rip them down, up and down one side or another, and question their faith and their Christianity and their commitment to God. No, or Twitter, there you go. Or any social media platform. Paul says that's not what you do. What you do when you disagree with someone is out of a sense of joy, instead of pushing them away, instead of attacking, you pull them into yourself and you protect them. And the reason you do that is because that is what God has done for you in Jesus. Is that God could have alienated you, he could have condemned you, but he didn't. Instead, he came to you out of love and gave his life and resurrected to bring you back to himself. So that's what we do for one another because that is what God has done for us. We accept each other because God has accepted us. That's Paul's, like, he starts off with, that's like his general umbrella policy. Paul's like, here's what you do. Here's the way it works. But again, he's already given some specific advice, but he's going to go on and give a little bit more specific advice. And Paul's going to root his further advice in reminding the church about something. See, Paul's going to remind us that Christian faith isn't just about our commitment to Jesus. It's about our commitment to one another. That when we make a decision to follow Jesus, we at the same time are choosing to identify with the people of God. So here's what he says, Romans 14, verse 13. He says, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. I'm convinced, being fully persuaded in the Lord Jesus, that nothing is unclean in itself. But if anyone, that went quick. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for that person it is unclean. If your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, you are no longer acting in love. Do not, by your own eating, destroy someone for whom Christ has died. And so Paul reminds us, he says, listen, within the context of Christian faith, we have an obligation to one another. See, one of the things that Western culture has done with faith or religion is it's privatized it. You go back, we've talked about this, but if you go back to like the philosophical movements and stuff that have shaped Western culture, the Renaissance, scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, all of that kind of like just kept moving religion and faith further and further until it's a private thing. Till your faith is, it's a personal thing between you and God, and don't make it public at all. But Christian faith, was never an individualized thing. Baptism was a step that people would take when they wanted to begin to follow Jesus. When you were baptized in the New Testament, it was clear you were baptized into Jesus and into his people. The New Testament doesn't understand a Christian outside of the context of the church, outside of the context of the family of God. It just doesn't exist. And so when we make the choice, we're going to follow Christ, we're going to be followers of Jesus, then we are committing to Jesus, but also to one another. So we have an obligation to Jesus and to each other. And so it's never now just about me. It's about how we live in relationship to one another. And what Paul says is, he goes, look, the way that you live, if it harms someone else, if it hurts someone else, if it drags someone else down, if it causes someone else to stumble, even though it's not a sin, it is wrong. That's a huge point Paul makes. Paul says, listen, it's possible that you're not sinning and you're still doing the wrong thing. Because if the way that you live in any way hurts someone else, brings someone else down, causes someone else to stumble, causes someone else to falter, then you're doing the wrong thing. Paul says, remember, all of these people, whether they agree with you or not, they are all people for whom Jesus died, and don't you dare destroy a person for whom Jesus died. That the way we live is never just about us. And again, for Paul, this is rooted in Jesus. Because what did Jesus do? Jesus came to earth and he gave his life for the benefit of other people. In Philippians, Paul writes that he literally emptied himself of everything for the benefit of other people. He gave himself away, sacrificed his everything for the benefit of other people. That's what our founder did. So what does it mean to follow him? To do the same thing. So Paul says, don't go around doing something and say, well, I can't. If it hurts someone else, you're doing the wrong things. See, Paul's point is, if all you and I do is insist on our individual rights and freedoms, and we destroy others, then we're not being Christian. Because that's not what Jesus Christ did. If we insist on our individual freedoms, what we end up doing is we do damage. Verse 19, he goes on. And he says, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. This is huge. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. All food is clean, but it is wrong for a person to eat anything that causes someone else to stumble. Paul says, listen, this whole issue, and again, he uses food, but you can substitute anything you want in there in food. Paul says what we end up doing is when we tack on to this thing that we disagree about, we literally end up destroying the work of God for the sake of winning this argument. Because remember, why does the church exist? The church exists because God has a mission in the world. And his mission is to reclaim and renew all of creation. That's why the church exists. That's the only reason the church exists. If there is no mission, there is no church. The church is a missional entity. When you and I, if we are within the church, if we begin fighting amongst ourselves over these disputable issues, who loses? The mission of the church. Because how do we live the mission of the church? One, we proclaim it, and two, we live it. So we announce the good news that, hey, in Jesus, God is making everything right. But we also live with Jesus as our king. This is what it looks like when we live with Jesus as our king. If we're not living like Jesus is our king, then the world looks at us and goes, I don't want anything to do with that. You're a dumpster fire. Why would I want anything to do with that? So the problem is when we divide, what fails is the mission of the church. The unity of the church. This is why Paul and other New Testament leaders, what they talk about more than anything else is the unity of the church, because the unity of the church is essential for the mission of the church. And they're not talking about false unity. False unity is when you say things like, oh, we'll just agree to disagree. That just means like, I'm just going to hate you silently and we're not going to fight publicly about it, but I'm still like going to resent you deep down inside. That's what that means. But again, what is real unity? Real unity is, guess what? You disagree with me. I know you disagree with me. I'm still going to pull you to myself and protect you. It's a choice that we are willing to lead into each other, not that we're going to push away from each other because, well, we just disagree. And Paul's saying, look, the reason why this is so important is because it's central. It is central to the mission of the church. And so Paul, when he's talking about this disputable matters, here's what he says. Paul says, the ideal situation would be if you have a disputable matter, would be to try to find what we call a win-win scenario, right? Where we can find this common ground and you win and I win. Paul says, but if you can't do that, if you can't find a win-win scenario, you know what you should look for? You should look for a scenario in which they win and you lose. And you know why? Say it with me. Because that's what Jesus did. He lost so that everyone around him could win. Paul says that's why we live this way. You find yourself in a disputable situation with someone else. You can't. So what do? You make the choice that benefits them, not you. Romans 15, verse 1 through 2, it kind of wraps the whole thing up. But he says this, we who are strong, which again, who's strong? All of us think we're strong because all of us think we're right. We who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Each of us should please our neighbors for their good to build them up. Paul says this is how we make choices. This is how we live. When you find yourself in these disputable matters, and again, a lot of disputable matters in the world in which we live. A lot of Christians disagree on them. And it gets frustrating because you have people on both sides who think they're right and they begin to question the faith and criticize. This is why the church in our culture is a mess. Because we haven't taken Paul's advice. Because Paul's saying, look, when you find these disputable matters, it's not an issue of which one of you loves God more, which one of you is more committed to God. You both are. You're both doing what you're doing out of your devotion and sincerity to God. But you've got to learn in those moments to build one another up rather than to tear each other down. Because the unity of the church is essential to the mission of the church. Because when we choose to major in the minors and fight over all these disputable things, what loses is the mission. And this is Paul's point. Paul's trying to help the Romans, and Paul's trying to help us. How do we navigate these tricky situations in our life? And so Paul uses meat and vegetables, and that's a great example for the culture that he lives in. I don't know about you. I don't really struggle with the meat, vegetables, sacrifice to idols. I don't really think we sacrifice meat to idols. But I want us to talk about what would be like a similar issue in the world in which we live today. And so let's use alcohol, because I think alcohol for us kind of falls in the same thing. That I don't know your background. I don't know how you grew up. I grew up going to church, and I grew up in what would be considered kind of a more conservative church, not like a crazy liberal conservative cult church thing, but it would be more conservative. And so when I grew up, my church, I didn't really know anybody at the church that drank. I thought drinking was a sin. It's weird. No one ever told me that. That's just kind of the vibe I got. Not that my parents didn't have a glass of wine every now and then, but there wasn't a lot of drinking in our house. A lot of our church friends didn't drink. So I literally grew up thinking that drinking was a sin. In fact, my grandfather, my grandma and grandpa were Lutheran. My whole mom and her whole family was raised up Lutheran. I used to, no joke, think that my grandpa was going to hell because at family get-togethers, he would have Budweiser. Like we go there and there would always be a cooler full of beer, and my grandpa and my uncle, they'd be drinking Budweiser. And I literally, as a kid, I used to think like, grandpa's gonna go to hell because he's drinking Budweiser. Not only that, the other thing he did that I thought he was going to hell for is like when he would look for something like on a bookshelf, he'd point with his middle finger. Like it would be his middle finger, and I'm like, does grandpa not know what that means? Like he's this, so like I had this, and again, no one ever told me that. There was no one in my church that ever sat down and was like, alcohol is a sin, but I just had that. And so I was like, grandpa's going to hell because of this. And as I learned, though, I got older, I learned what Lutheran is. And I don't know if you're familiar with Lutheran. Lutheran comes from, it's a tradition that comes from Martin Luther, who was the guy who started the Protestant Reformation. And it came out of Germany, right? And so German culture, beer is a big part of German culture. And even Luther himself, one of the many things Luther did, is he took drinking songs that drunk people would sing in bars, and he rewrote the words to be like praise songs about Jesus. And so like literally within the Lutheran tradition, beer is a part of it. You just have to have it. Like Lutheran family, Lutheran church things, they just all drink beer. It's just what it is. And so I took a class on Lutheranism, and afterwards the guys would always go to this local bar, and I never went with them, but they'd go and they'd drink and they'd talk about Luther. So like that's a part of that, but that wasn't my church. Mine was different. And so again, I don't know what you grew, but there's like, I grew up with this, no, it's bad, it's wrong, but it's not a sin. Paul, in fact, one time tells Timothy, who's his protege, Paul tells Timothy, he's like, dude, you got stomach problems, have a glass of red wine, it'll help you out. And Jesus' first miracle, right? What's Jesus' first miracle in the Gospel of John? Is Jesus actually takes these giant stone jars and he fills them full of water and then turns it into wine. He makes a bunch of wine for this party. And so alcohol is not a sin. It's not. And if anyone has ever told you that, they're wrong. It's not a sin. But it is also can be very destructive, incredibly destructive. And I'm sure there's a lot of us in here who have experienced the destructive power of alcohol, either in our own life or maybe in the families we grew up in. When there's alcoholism and it leads to destroyed lives, destroyed marriages, destroyed families. And so on the one hand, it's not a sin. It isn't. But on the other hand, I understand why some people don't do it and why they tell other people not to do it. So the question then becomes like, what do you do? You have this issue that it can go either way, and it makes sense to go either way. So what do we do with it? So a lot of times within churches, it's really awkward, and it's really strange, and a lot of times what we do in churches, we end up hiding it. Like, I'll drink, I just won't let anyone know that I'm doing it. But what do we do? How do we deal with it? I remember years ago, I was down in Chile. We work with an organization down in Chile that they do some amazing work. And so we were down there. It was a team it was all staff members from the church here and from our school, HCS. And we had all gone down there to kind of explore how we could all kind of partner together. And we go to this little village on the coast of Chile called Iloca. And Iloca was a small little fishing village, and it had been destroyed by a tsunami. And so the organization that we work with in Chile, they'd send a bunch of teams down there to rebuild and to do some work. So we go down there to check it out. And we're down there all day kind of building, working with these people, having a good time. And that night, this family invites us over to their house to cook us dinner to say thank you for what we've done. And we have a policy, I think it's still a policy, I could be wrong, but I think it's still a policy that when you go on a global trip with the church, we're not allowed to drink alcohol. And the reason for that is some of the places we go, like alcohol is viewed as really bad, some places not bad, but we just like, hey, let's just avoid the controversy and you're not allowed to do it. In Chile, even at their like church get-togethers, they'll always have wine, they'll always have beer. It's just a cultural thing. It's not a big deal. It doesn't really cause any division. It's a cultural deal. So we go to these people's house, and these people were not wealthy by any means. I mean, they lived in what we would probably describe as a shanty. I mean, it was like just like planks of wood, like pieces of wood held up, and the table was just a piece of wood. And so, but they had cooked us this really good fish dinner. They'd caught fresh that day, and they cooked it all up, and they literally gave everything they had for us to be here. And so we go into their house, and we're all sitting down around this table, and it's this family, it's some of the fishers from the village, it's like the pastor of the church, and it's all of us on staff, and we sit down, and they say a prayer. And I open my eyes after the prayer, and I look, and I realize the only thing to drink on this table is alcohol. There's wine and beer. And I look around, and I think everybody else on our staff looks at me too, and they all just look at me like, what are we going to do? Like, we had gone over the policy. We know this is against the policy. What are we going to do? And like, my heart starts racing. I'm like looking around. They're all looking at me. I was like the youngest person there at the time, but they're all looking at me because I'm the lead pastor. So like, what are we going to do? And they look around, and everyone looks at me, and the family's looking at me, and they're smiling, and they've offered this hospitality. And so I just picked up my cup. I'm like, bottoms up, and I just took a drink. Like, what was I supposed to do? I didn't. I don't even really like red wine, which is what they had, but I was like, okay, there it is, and then they all looked at me, they're like, I guess we're doing this. And so they all did it, and that night when it was just us, they're like, I'm so glad you did. I didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to do. But it's kind of uncomfortable. Like, what do we do with it? I remember another time, actually, my friend from Chile, the guy, he was coming up to stay with us. And he was coming up that night, and I was driving home from work. And I have alcohol in my house. I do. I don't drink a lot. I'll have it from time to time. And so I was driving home, and I realized he's coming in that night, and I'm like, I don't have any beer for him. And again, Chile, he likes to drink beer. So I stop at Ralph's right here on the corner of Golden West and Garfield and go in just to get a 6-pack of beer. That's literally all I'm getting. And so I go in there, and I go into the alcohol aisle, and I find the beer that he likes, and I stack it out, and I'm standing there, just me, in the alcohol aisle with my 6-pack of beer, and all of a sudden from the end of the aisle I hear, hey, Pastor Scott! And like I turn, and it's just me holding, and I'm like trying to hide it. Like, do I hide it? What do I do? Like, it's weird. Like, what do you do with it? What do you do? Because again, it's not a sin. It's not. But on the other hand, it can be very destructive. And so we kind of get in this weird place where like, do I do it? Do I not do it? I can do it, but I won't tell people. Like, and so what is it that Paul's telling us to do here? What is Paul's advice? And here's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, when you get into these disputable matters, Paul says, really what you have to do is you have to let the context dictate the choices that you make and the way that you respond. Look at the situation and ask yourself, in this situation, how does this impact the people around me? Like, if you're out with your spouse and the two of you want to get a glass of wine, get a glass of wine. But if you're out with someone that you know struggles with alcohol addiction or is working through recovery, probably not the best thing to do. And even sometimes I try to be careful, and I'm not telling you need to do this. Again, it's a really great thing. But like a lot of times, like I said, I don't drink all that much, but a lot of times if I go out, I just kind of won't drink when I go out in restaurants, not because I think it's bad, not because I think it's judgmental. And again, I'm not saying I never do it, but I don't want to be the reason that someone goes, oh, well, there's Pastor, he's having to drink, I'll do it too. And then it leads to something worse in their life. And so really, you kind of have to use discernment in every situation. And here's I think really what Paul's telling us. Paul's telling us, like, look, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And just because you don't doesn't mean it's wrong. That there's a tension that you have to live in, and you have to let the situation dictate, how am I going to respond here? And the point is not to win. The point is not to be right. The point is not to exercise my freedom because I can. The point is, how do I live in such a way so as to build the other person up? I took the drink of that glass of red wine down in Chile because I believed in that moment this was the right thing to do. I knew everyone that was like, I just felt like, I've shared this question with you before, but I think this is what Paul's getting at. Paul's saying that when it comes to the way we interact with each other over disputable matters, here's the question that should drive our decision making. Here it is. What does love require of me? In this moment, in this situation, I did what I did in Chile. I reached out and took that glass because I believed in that moment that's what love required from me. That here was these people that gave us literally everything they can. They opened their home that was by no means nice. They shared the best of what they had. And so I believe that in that moment, the gracious way to respond, to receive their hospitality, was to do that. That's why I did it. There's other times where I don't drink. Because that's what love requires from me. Because the point isn't me getting what I want. Like I said, drinking is not a sin. But if you're drinking to self-medicate, if you can't cope throughout the day because you can't have a drink, that's destructive. Like, you need to get help with that. You do. But just because someone drinks doesn't make them bad. We have to learn that we're all not going to agree. We all don't have the same experiences. We all don't have the same past. That doesn't make us right and them wrong. It makes us human. And my biggest hope for us as a church is that we can recover the fact that what is central to the health and the thriving of any church is the mission of the church. That we proclaim and we live the good news that Jesus died and rose again, and through him, God is once again King of the universe. And we only do that when we learn to respond to each other this way. When we learn to live in unity. And again, unity isn't, let's agree to disagree. Unity is, I know we disagree, but I'm still going to live in a way that is loving to you. It's not about me. It's not about my requirements. It's about what does love require of me to build other people up. And you know why we live that way? Because we're Christian. It's what Christian people do. Because it's what Jesus Christ did. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you that you entered into the mess of our lives. That you just didn't send down a book. You came down yourself in flesh and blood. And you entered into our mess and our discomfort and our tension. And you showed us what it means to really live. And Father, I pray that in the midst of everything we're experiencing in our lives and our world, that God, we would recover what it really means to be a church, what it really means to follow you. That God, we would realize that it's not about us winning. It's about how we build each other up. The church wins when we choose to build each other up, when we choose to let love dictate how we act in any given moment. That God, just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Sometimes I know those of us who grew up in what we might consider legalistic things, we try to celebrate these freedoms. Oh, look, I can do this, I can do this. But God, just because we can doesn't mean we should. But just because we don't doesn't mean it's wrong. And doesn't mean the people who do it are somehow evil. God, we got to stop looking on each other with contempt and judgment and realize that we are your children made in your image. And we all have to act in ways that build other people up so that you, your glory, and the mission of the church is ultimately what wins. God, we love you and thank you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.